our main topic today here on Mastering Dungeons, we have the honor and the pleasure of being joined by Shannon Appelcline, one of our hobby's most renowned historians. We're going to discuss his newest project, Designers and Dragons Origins. But we also just want to step back and learn a little bit more about Shannon. So, Shannon, first of all, thank you for coming on the show. We are ecstatic to have you here.
Yeah,
Thanks so much for having me.
it's so cool to have you. We'll talk about the various things you've made, but I'm a big fan. In fact, I was reading through Designers and Dragons, the original one, and I found that it was a Christmas gift for my parents, and I was like, oh, that's so cool. And so clearly, like, something I had on like my list of I really want this, and they had bought it for me, which is awesome.
And it's a real rarity. I think we printed about 750 of those from what my royalty statement said.
Wow. Probably true.
Yeah, 99% true. So before we dive into your projects, could we just get a little bit about your origin story, both as a historian and as a person in the gaming industry or the gaming hobby?
Sure. I got started with Dungeons and Dragons, the Moldvay BX set. I asked my dad for it for a Christmas or birthday present, I don't know which, and he not only got it for me, but he ran me through my first dungeon, even though he's not really a gamer, doesn't like it that much, but he sort of figured out the rules and laid out a dungeon and took me through it. I think he was drawing on his experience that we both had playing old adventure games like The Colossal Cave. I went on to many other games over the years, Stormbringer, RuneQuest, Ars Magica as I came into college. And so I had a decently wide array of gaming that I'd played. And I ended up running RPGNet by kind of accident because my boss saved the site when it had just been bought by Hollywood people who then ended up not paying for it, and it needed a new hosting site. And so he provided a new hosting site for it and eventually acquired it himself. And that brought me to wanting to produce content for the site. And some of the content that I produced was an index of products, and some of the content I produced was various articles. I wrote some on online gaming. And then when I started putting together this index, this catalog of products, I started thinking about, hey, what happened to these companies? What were their stories? And I wrote up one of those histories and then a few more and started publishing those. I don't have particular training as a historian. I did study a lot of history at college. I had a great high school U.S. history teacher. I was always a real fan of the topic, and it just kind of all came together very organically, as many things do. And as I've seen so often in this industry, one happenstance leads to another, and then suddenly there's a big game system, a big company, or in this case, some histories of the industry.
You must have had some appreciation for or some predilection towards the nuances of history, because reading, I think one of my friends in my gaming group first pointed me to your columns on RPGNet and was like, you've got to check out what this guy says about the industry, because I was at a time when I was asking a lot of questions, and you had a way of getting into the details and caring about how it all came together, but then also an uncanny ability to pull back and explain why this was relevant and why it mattered. And do you credit that to anything in particular?
I probably will. Thank you. First of all, that's very generous. I'm also a computer scientist, and so I think I look at things very logically. And so I have this kind of split brain where I have the creative half and I have the logical half, and I suspect those come together when I write the histories. I go through, and I find all the facts I can, research everything I can. And so that gives me all of the details. And then I look and see how can I, while staying true to the actual facts, farm this into a story. And that probably goes to, long years of GMing and stuff too. We all learn how to tell stories, and we all learn how to tell stories molding facts. It's just in role playing, we're often molding the facts of what the players are doing. And here I'm molding the facts of, what actually happened and how does it farm an interesting narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. The So when you started writing on RPGNet, how did that become the idea of collecting it all together?
Lisa Stevens is how it became. She approached me. She wasn't the only one who approached me, but she was the one who most seriously did and said, "Hey, we'd like to make a book of this." And so we talked about it for a while. It ended up not working out for a variety of reasons, but she was really the impetus that led to these being books. And later, Matthew Sprang, of course, at Mongoose, was the one who eventually published the first edition. And I did some work when we were planning for Paizo, and I did some work when we actually published through Mongoose. And both of those were just so much more intensive work than what I did for RPGNet. RPGNet, I wrote a history every month probably. And suddenly, when I was working for deadlines that we were talking about books, I was doing a couple of histories a week. And so, in part, the impetus of someone else saying we'd like it as a book, and in part, a whole bunch of work going into that in evenings after I did my regular job.
We know that feeling.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I have a question about the process of this. Uh, you were writing about the history of these companies, and it wasn't like you were writing about the Middle Ages, but it also wasn't like you were writing about something happening right at the moment, more journalism. So, what was the process like for you in terms of getting the information, getting people to tell you things, finding the data that you needed to make these books?
Yeah. Actually, I tried to minimize people telling me things. The danger in any history writing like this is if people tell you things, especially if they're things that were 20 or 30 years ago, and especially if they're things that were 20 or 30 years ago and they've told the story of many, many times, it's going to be increasingly inaccurate. So the first thing I did was I was always a magazine-ophile. I had collections of Dragon, Different World, Space Gamer, all of the classic magazines from uh, the olden days now, I guess. And so those were my first resource. A lot of them had good news columns. A lot of them had design notes for various games, and there were some interviews with people. And so those were always my first source. I did the originals almost 20 years ago now, and I can't quite conceive of how I would have done them because obviously those were vast, largely uncatalogued groups of magazines. And I know, like, I started with Imperium Games. I went on to Wizards of the Coast, Chaosium. I'm not quite sure the methodology of did I just search through those magazines looking for the individual mentions? Did I make one run through the magazines altogether? I've certainly gone through all of those magazines many times now. And before I started on the third edition of the books, I do want to try and catalog a lot of the news better, but it's such a big topic. But that's always the first thing. Go through the magazines, especially for the things in that time. Nowadays, I can go through their websites. I can go through archive.org and see what was on the website years ago. We have any number of good news sources online, InWorld, TTRPG Insider, many others. We have podcasts and videos, which I do listen to, but they take so much more time than just reading something. So all of those sources are always what I go to first. I said I don't like to talk to people, but I almost always do. But what I try and do is I try and get together my own draft of what I think happened and then offer it to them and say, is this accurate and not accurate, so that I'm not immediately biased by what they might think happened now. And I've been surprised more than once by people saying, wow, I never saw all of that together. Wow, I never realized my story looked like this. Unfortunately, often I didn't remember that at all.
Yeah, yeah. John Peterson made a comment at one point, I recall reading, and sort of saying, like, our initial cuts at history would just take as gospel something somebody would say, a Gary Gygax. And it's only later that, at least John was saying, he took a look and could say, wow, that was super biased, or it had an agenda even at times. And every person has some perspective, right? And so you have to overlay them. And I think Sean and I see that as well as we get older and wiser to the industry. A lot of people come in that are new and they have a particular perspective. but they don't know all of that background, even in their own company, which is fascinating.
Yeah, I think a lot of people who aren't as old as we are may not realize that when we were coming up in gaming, we really didn't even know who Dave Arneson was. We didn't realize that there was anyone but Gary Gygax involved in Dungeons and Dragons. We thought Gary Gygax probably did like the whole BCMI set that we now know Frank Mincer did, Oriental Adventures, which we know David Zeb Cook did, all of that. And that's because Gary's name was all over all of that, even the things that he really had very minimal involvement with. So there was definitely a, intent there. There was definitely a, kind of raising up of Gary as the designer behind Dungeons and Dragons. And so that really impacted a lot of history for a long time until people started looking more in depth into it. And John is the one who's really gone in depth to that. I mean, I would highly suggest his Game Wizards to really show, hey, what happened between Gary and Dave. And also Ben Riggs' Slaying the Dragon, because that really shows, hey, what happened between Gary and the Blooms and Lorraine Williams, Lorraine Williams and the Blooms, again, people that probably only ones who've read some of these histories really know a lot about, but they're really demonized. And, they probably did a lot of things that were good, and I really wish we'd see their stories. But Ben's tried to get interviews with Lorraine Williams, and it hasn't worked.
Yeah, and thinking of this original massive tome that you did, Mongoose likes the thick pages, but even still, it's 400 plus of this massive tome. It's beautiful, and when I received it from my parents for Christmas, it was a nothing. I'd never seen something like it before. Not only because it broke down D&D in a way I'd never seen before, but in the same way that Gary overshadows other designers, D&D overshadows other companies, and you really brought a spotlight and a care to all of these other companies that people don't necessarily remember or think of actively. What drew you to want to do that, to really say, no, this company, small as it may have been, played a vital role in it, and I want to record that?
Well, the first one I wrote was Imperium Games. And Imperium Games is definitely the definition of a small company. I think almost no one would know who they are today. They were the people who picked up the Traveler license after GDW went out of business, and they were just there for, I think, a little more than 2 years, and they exploded rather spectacularly. But that was the company that got me into it, just because I've always been a fan of Traveler. I stopped buying their products when I started working for Chaosium and didn't have money anymore. And so when I came back and I started putting these into that catalog I was talking about, I saw that, hey, they did these layer books I never knew about. What happened and why'd they go out of business? And so it kind of was baked in that the first company that interested me was this one that no one knew about anymore. And I've also long since college been a big fan of Chaosium. And Chaosium, they're definitely a second tier company. I mean, maybe there's no one first tier except Wizards of the Coast. It's hard to say. They've got a very long history. They're the longest existing role-playing publisher at this point. Just hit their 50th anniversary a few days ago, as we are taping this on Halloween. And but they're smaller. They were probably even smaller when I was writing the original one, because they were teetering on bankruptcy, as they have often during their lifetime. And so that was another one where, hey, it was kind of baked in. And so once you do a couple of like that, and once you're kind of invested in recording much of the history of the industry, and there's only one Wizards of the Coast you can write and only one TSR you can write, and I apparently wasn't interested in writing a large tome on the book like John or Ben has, you have to keep going. And it's been even more incentivized as I've gone on, because when we converted from that Mongoose book to the second edition by Evil Hat, we split it up by decade.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant that I had to figure out, hey, I actually don't have enough word count for the 90s. What other 90s companies can I find? And more recently, I've been going back and coming up with a new equal selection of new companies to write about in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and odd odds. And so that's caused me to go back again and say, hey, what other companies are there that haven't I haven't written about? So it's kind of naturally evolved from that initial desire to write about a few particular companies and expanded as it's been popular and people have been interested and said, hey, write more of these.
Yeah, and this 4-book set that you did for Evil Hat, which took the material in the original tome, revised it. We get these awesome color outer covers, really nice layout, and it's broken down by decades: 70s, 80s, 90s, zeros. How did that end up happening? That did you approach Evil Hat? Did they approach you? And how did you approach that task of revising what you had written?
It was happenstance again. I used to go to a game store called In Game in Oakland, California.
Mhm.
And one of the co-owners of In Game is Chris Hanrahan. And Chris Hanrahan was also the marketing director, I think, at the time for Evil Hat. And so shortly after the Mongoose edition came out, Chris, said, hey, I really like that book. If it ever comes available again, talk to me and we'll get it published through Evil Hat. I mean, I kind of feel a little bad because most of the work actually involved in getting these to publication has been people approaching me and say, hey, we'd like that. Would you like to publish it with us? Which isn't how it usually works. It's been very fortunate. It's probably due to the uniqueness of the material. The material, if anyone had written it, it would have been very unique and there would have been interest. But Evil Mongoose dropped the book out of print within a few months of printing it. Like I said, we printed about 750. My contract said I could reclaim the rights if it was out of print for 6 months. And so when it dropped out of print for 6 months, I went ahead and grabbed my rights back from Mongoose and said, sure, have a try at it. And we figured out they didn't want to do a big book. I think I came up with the idea of maybe we could split up from decades. And then there was certainly a little updating at that point. I think the Mongoose books and the Evil Hat books are 5 years apart from each other, something like that. And so there was updating. I had to go through each one. I didn't do heavy revisions of them, but what I did do was I added something like 100,000 words of new content, maybe a little bit more. And that was mostly new histories to fill in the decades. Some of the books were pretty full out already. And I think maybe the 80s was pretty full out, whereas the Odd Outs was almost entirely new because the decade hadn't been finished previously.
Do you recall any surprises or changes that were happening either in the hobby overall that changed how you approached the task, or specific views that you had of companies that changed? Anything like that?
The biggest change, I would say, was that John Peterson had come out with Playing at the World between my first and second edition. And so I definitely consulted that and filled in a lot of details in the TSR article between the first one and the second one and that, because he'd done huge amounts of primary research with content that just wasn't available to the rest of us, a lot of small press zines and stuff that none of us had ever seen. Coming up on the second edition of the books, also, Wizards of the Coast was in great upheaval at the time. I think 2013 is when we kickstarted it, and 2014 is when we came out with it. And 2012 is when Wizards of the Coast stopped putting out 4E material very suddenly. And so there was a feeling of positivity. I think generally felt pretty good about the industry when the first edition came out, and when the second edition came out, a lot of us were wondering if the industry was going to survive, because you talk about all of these other companies that are in the history, and they're all very important, but they're all just a fraction of what Wizards of the Coast, TSR, D&D does. I don't know the exact numbers, but I wouldn't be shocked if D&D is still 80, 85, 90% of the industry, even though we have all of these other great companies with all of these great products. And so when they weren't coming out with products, I mean, I was asking, people aren't going to game stores anymore. Is that going to kill the rest of the hobby? And so those were probably the two big things. We had more historians, and thus they were kind of providing more grist for the mill. And also we had a feeling that the industry might not be surviving.
Wow. Yeah. And go for it, Shawn.
Well, I was going to switch gears for just a second and ask about your creation outside of the histories. So you've worked with White Wolf, you worked with Chasm, you worked with others. Does the game side of the history mesh with the game itself? In your experience, what have you learned from the game and what that means for the people and the companies within it?
I think games are usually pretty good reflections of the companies and their interest. I mean, you have someone like Greg Stafford, and he was a modern day shaman, and his RuneQuest really reflects that in its focus on mythology and spirituality. And you have other games that are very action oriented, and often you have people in those companies that reflect those things. Um, I would say the biggest kind of interaction between the games and the companies is an unfortunate one, which is that so many companies have been run by designers over the years, and so many designers don't know how to run companies. I worked at Chaosium for 2.5 years, and I loved all of the people there. They were all great people, some of my favorite people in the world, but there was not a lot of great running of company there. Um, and the unfortunate flip side is you look at something like TSR, and TSR had a lot of business people in it. I mentioned the Bloom brothers, Brian and Kevin. I mentioned Lorraine Williams. They were very business oriented people, and the creatives all hated them and felt like they were killing the company, which probably was not entirely accurate. It probably had bad effects on some design and probably good effects on the bottom line sometimes. So that's the other thing I'd say, with where does the design and the business interact? And it's in this disconnect.
Yeah, that is wild. And we still see that today, right? I mean, I think there's you see wizards struggling with what is the right balance of executives, right? Will these Amazon, Microsoft people bring in an intelligence level that uplifts, or will they create competitive silos that stab each other in the back and move piles of money around to do things that don't actually elevate, right?
And we've seen way too much backstabbing from Wizards of the Coast. Wizards, I mean, I feel bad for the designers. They're awful because they're working at their dream jobs. They're working on the role-playing game that's most likely to be played by anyone ever. And, they've got people just trying to figure out how to maximize their profits in the background, which is not to the benefit of those designers or us wanting to play the games often.
It's funny how in a game of D&D, you need your party to work together, right? You need the rogue to do the rogue things. You need the wizard to do the wizard things. And it's very much like that at a company. As long as everyone understands their role, doesn't try to solo the monster, doesn't try, right, to come together. And we have seen, as you've said so many times, where one person thinks that they are the party rather than a part of the party. And it usually ends poorly.
It's interesting that you can expand that and say that in 1999, 2000, Wizards of the Coast understood that applied to the whole industry, that, they couldn't solo alone either, that they were made better by having people produce the stuff that was less profitable. And we got the, OGL and the D20 boom. And, 2.5 years ago now, I guess they said, no, we're going to solo it, or, you're going to pay us mercenary fees.
Yeah. And how quickly that switched, and we get now things like third-party publishers on D&D Beyond,
Mm-hmm.
and more partnerships, it looks like.
Yeah.
So that lesson seemed to have been learned very quickly, maybe by somebody internally, or maybe by just the fan outrage that
Yeah.
was foisted upon them.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
the fans, we really have to pay them a lot of respect, and that they pretty much stopped that from happening and maybe saved the industry. And I think it probably made Wizards listen to the designers better, because I think from everything we heard about the whole OGL fiasco, the designers were on the right side, and they said, this isn't going to turn out well for you.
Yeah. Yeah, it was interesting speaking to staff who would emotionally describe what it was like to hear that this happened, right? To learn of it as we were learning of it because they had not been in the loop.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, and I think that this type of understanding of history is something that's always, as a fan and also as an industry member, blown my mind. Like when I read the original tome that you put together, and you talked about novels and thinking through that idea of like novels being this runaway hit until they aren't, and until you have all these unsold books. And then John does work. I think it's like you guys are building scaffolding for each other, right? John does work to look into what all this means, and then Ben does work to look at what all this means, and we start finding what is now a much more complete picture of TSR and how its finances created the problem that led to it having to be sold and almost being stripped for parts. And it is really fascinating to see. I think both the history itself and how important it is to understand that history so that other companies can also learn from this, because Wizards is not alone, as you said before, making these mistakes. Lots of small companies are also making mistakes and undermining their own success, right?
Yeah, when I called the books Designers and Dragons, the intent was always that the dragons would be these problems that the designers and the companies faced. And the hope was always that they would be things that we could teach and show, hey, that didn't work out. One of my friends, when he read my books for the first time, said, wow, this is just a story of a bunch of small little companies all suing each other for nothing. And that's certainly one of the dragons that I hope we've learned from since TSR days, because they were very litigious.
Yeah. So maybe we should pivot to the most important thing, which is that there is currently on BackerKit this amazing offering that you have penned, and it is called Designers and Dragons Origins. And while it has Designers and Dragons in the title, this is not a revision of your previous works. This is a brand new offering that is focused on the products that were created in the earlier days up through, I think, 1995, looking at each of the products that came out, which is an amazing undertaking, I think made easier by the fact that you worked on DMsGuild, D&D Classics type work. But I please tell us about this project and how this came to be.
Yeah, so this Designers and Dragons Origins is a 4-book set of histories that cover approximately, Evil Hats counted and said, about 320 products. It fundamentally covers 1974 to 1988, which was OD&D and AD&D first edition, but also goes along the parallel track and covers basic Dungeons and Dragons and Mystara that came afterward. And so that runs 1977 to 1997, I think, somewhere in there. But the 95. But the biggest is the kind of really classic region, because the basic D&D stuff was getting less and less frequent the more further it went. So it came about because I had already written the Mongoose edition of Designers and Dragons, and DriveThru RPG contacted me and said, hey, we have this new exciting new project. We can't tell you what it is. We'd like you to do some writing for it. And I said, okay. And they gave me an NDA, and it was that they were going to be putting all of the D&D products back in PDFs. They'd been off the market for 5 or 6 years because Wizards of the Coast was afraid that they were going to be pirated copies, and so they took all the official ones off, which is, of course, very stupid. Um, but typical of corporate thinking, all they did was ensure that all that was out there was the pirated ones, of course. But Drive-Thru RPG, they built their initial reputation on making publishers feel better and more confident about putting product out there. And that was originally through some DMCA controlling the products so that you couldn't necessarily do things with them, but they eventually cut back on that and moved it to just watermarks, and many things don't even have watermarks now. But that was how they got in initially. They said, hey, we can make you feel better about having your products out there online.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so they were coming back and they were doing new ones. And they said, hey, we really want to make this an event. We're going to be publishing, 6 or 7 every week after an initial period of, putting out 30 or 40 to really blow people's minds. And we'd like little descriptions, histories maybe with each. And so they approached 2 people, myself and Kevin Culp, and we split D&D down the middle. I did OD&D, AD&D first edition, and basic D&D. He did third edition, and we kind of split the million products for AD&D second edition. I think he probably did more than I did. And we started writing them, and we put out this big initial set, and then we fell into each doing 2, 3, 4 a week. And Kevin burned out. I did not burn out, in main part because I'd kept rights to the histories. When I did my initial negotiations with Drive-Thru RPG, I'd already put out this one book, and I'd said, hey, maybe someday these could be a book too. And they very kindly negotiated, even though they were, very busy trying to get this whole site online. And because I owned these histories that I wrote with just, a minor exclusivity period for them, I was encouraged to keep writing them and keep writing them and keep writing them, which I did for 5 years, putting out every single week 3 or 4 of them. And I got done with that, and I had not quite 1 million words. And I said, maybe these could be some books. And fast forward a couple of years, I decided to make a leap of faith and stepped back from my full-time job and went to contract technical writing as my main moneymaker. And then I took the other half of my time and put that on histories. And so I've been rearranging, rewriting, revising, expanding what I wrote for Drive-Thru RPG into these books, and I've been putting together 1 book a year. And so Designers and Dragons Origins is the first 4 books.
That's great.
Yeah. So how did the process of doing this particular bit of history differ from the previous stuff you've done, going from sort of looking at companies and people to looking at products?
It was much more a fire hose of information. With a company, I might get together 20, 30 sources and use that to write a history that might be, 20 or 30 pages long. I think TSR is my oldest, and the current book's at 100 pages long or so. But for these product histories, I might have to gather 10 or 15 sources to really get a good understanding of it. And that was going to be for like all of the histories in their final form, which tend to be a fair amount longer than they were on the original site. They run 2 to 10 pages. And so there was so much more. I actually had a pattern, which, I mostly did for most of the 5 years, where every week I would look and I would see what the products were that I was going to be writing about that week. Friday night, I would sit down after the work week was over, and I would research and try and collect together all of my data I could find, all of the interviews where people had talked about them, often reviews and discussions of them for a lot of the details. And of course, looking through the product itself, as I always got copies from Drive-Thru. And I'd dump all of those into files. And then Saturday, I would take my bike or out somewhere, or I'd go hiking out somewhere, and I'd eventually find myself a picnic table, and I'd sit and I'd write through the afternoon, and it'd start to get dark, and I'd decide I better go. And the wife was probably wondering where I was for dinner. And then Sunday, I'd edit those and upload them to Drive Through RPG. And so, if anyone ever asks how you write a book, you just do that for 5 years straight.
I love that. That's great. Well, we are very glad you've done that. The backers and again, you can go to BackerKit right now and search for Designers and Dragons Origins and back this. I can't wait to get my hands on this. And there is a 57-page preview PDF that folks can get, and it's been growing as more people back it. It includes a view at a number of different products across the ages, and they're all very amazing. We shared 2 on a previous episode. How did you use a sort of common format to talk about a product, and how did you settle on that format?
Well, in my 5 years of writing, I kind of slowly came in on some formatting. If you look at some of my earliest ones, they're often very short, and I, just, hey, here was an interesting story. I heard about this. And over time, I eventually settled on, hey, I have some things called origins, which are just actual history about this. I have some topics. Sometimes I write about the rules that came in, or the NPCs, or the world. The world was a common one in the earlier ones. So when I started compiling these into actual books, I had all of these histories I'd written, and they had all of these different topics, and sometimes they'd evolved into kind of coherent sets of things I talked about, and sometimes they hadn't. But looking at all of these, and especially looking at kind of the first book's worth, I was able to isolate, hey, what were all of the individual things I talked about in these, 70 or 80 different histories? And putting all those together, hey, I suddenly had a format. And not only did I have a format, but I had a format that I could look at each individual history and say, oh, I didn't talk about the new rules in this one. I didn't talk about how this expanded the world of Greyhawk, et cetera. And so it also gave me guidance for how I should expand these various ones. So organic is, as so many of these things are. But then when I got down and I put them into books, very carefully considered and organized. I actually have a couple of different files in which I list out all of the sections and all of the possible subsections, all of the possible tropes or other common things that I talk about, so that I know I'm always using the same language, so that I know I'm always looking at the same things and describing them in the same way, hopefully.
That's awesome. So Volume 1 is OD&D and AD&D through 1983. On the show, we talked about the Fiend Folio and the Greyhawk supplement, which is included in the preview. Any other products that stand out for this early time period that you want to share with listeners?
Well, it's a little hard to suss out what's exactly in each. I think the first one ends with Gary Gygax's kind of farewell to Greyhawk, which actually goes out to 84, 85, but you are right, the book says 83 because that's where the main part ends. And you get a bunch of these very interesting books like Dungeon Land and The Temple of Elemental Evil, that kind of were some of our few detailings of what Gary Gygax imagined as that kind of primordial world of Greyhawk that we've never really seen what it was like. And so I really enjoy those. Dungeon Land, it's adventure I think that would be too humorous for a lot of modern players. It's based on Alice in Wonderland. But I just find it so intriguing. And you can see how this is from the same campaign where he also sent people, to Mars and to China and to other things like that. And so I love that one just as a look at this primordial setting that we know so little about. And the Temple of Elemental Evil is a very different thing. It kind of bookends this period. And that's because it was one that he ran very late in the Greyhawk campaign, and he was playing with things like random dungeons and stuff. And one of the reasons that Temple of Elemental Evil was long promised, because it was promised for, I don't know, 5 years or so before it came out, and never came out, was because it was built on all of these random charts without anything but the very core of the temple actually being fully defined. And so Frank Mintzer actually had to go through all these charts and other notes that Gary had written and design it into an actual, thing. But we have these stories about, how his original group ran through it, and how Rob Kuntz came in and opened up the temple and ruined everything. And they're just, again, these fascinating looks at the earliest D&D that, goes back to even before these publications.
Yeah. I love in the second volume, you talk about one of the product histories that's in the sample is Isle of the Ape. And there are a number of things about it that I love. The first is you talk about the cover art done by Jeff Easley that's listed as Jack Fred. And can you share that, where Jack Fred comes from?
Yeah, Jack Fred was a name that was used by the artist bullpen at TSR when they produced work that they were not happy with, usually because they were asked to produce it too quickly. And so it's funny, the Temple of Elemental Evil, it is full of Jack Fred artwork. We think by maybe up to 3 different artists. Not the cover, but the interior black and white work. And there are only 2 covers. I've lost track of what the other one is, but there's only 2 covers that were actually Jack Fred, and Isle of the Ape is one of the 2 of those. But it's just, they had to do it too happy. They did not want to put their name on it.
It's great. And Isle of the Ape is this strange adventure, full of interesting aspects. What sticks out to you from its history that you want to share?
Well, it of course was another of these weird extra areas that were connected up to Greyhawk, just like Dungeon Land that I mentioned earlier. This was basically Skull Island for King Kong, and put into D&D. And so again, it shows how D&D was this. It collected all of these different things together. It wasn't as concerned about creating a coherent world as creating somewhere fun to adventure as it was envisioned originally by Gary. One of the other interesting things about Isle is that it was at the time the highest level adventure that was ever produced. Queen of the Demon Web Pits was the previous one. Queen of the Demon Web Pits went up to 14th level, and this one went up to 18th. And so Gary had to ask, how do I produce an adventure like this that, actually challenges higher level adventures? And his answer was one that I'm not sure I've seen anywhere else. It was attrition. Basically, equipment got destroyed over time in the harsh environment of Isle of the Ape. I think people took damage too. Kind of a weird answer, but I think it reflects how early it was in the history of D&D. I mean, we're more than a decade on now, 1986, but still, they're trying to figure out how do we expand the game. And of course, this exact same time, Frank Mintz's BCMI adventures, rulebooks were making a much more comprehensive answer to this question. And, it was, you have warfare, you have castles, and eventually people become immortals. But here was Gary's answer.
Yeah. And I think that as a young fan at that time, I kept thinking of any new Greyhawk release as, oh, this will give me the answer into the genius that is Gary's brain at running a campaign, and give me all the lore that I'm looking for what's in Castle Greyhawk. And instead is you get transported to this island that has nothing to do with Greyhawk, really. Yeah. There's a Crook of Rao to recover. Oh, there's no stats for it. Like it's completely not what we expected.
Yeah, I mean, I say I love Dungeon Land, but to be honest, Isle of the Ape disappointed me. And that may have been that it was so high level that it was never going to be used. But it was just so explicitly King Kong, which is funny because, like I said, I loved the Alice in Wonderland of the other. But I don't know, for me, the one felt kind of like it was appropriate for D&D, and the other felt like it was a bit of a stretch.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So while AD&D is happening, we also get this parallel product of the Holmes D&D edition, BX and BECMI. What was most notable about that, especially in contrast with what was going on the AD&D side?
Oh. I can think of several things that were notable. The first thing is that all of those basic sets, they were really the introduction to the game for so many people. Holmes was built to kind of clean up the rules and make them more playable. But from BX to BECMI, each of them, they were asking, how can we make this more introductory? How can we make this more appealing to new players? And they were wildly successful. We use the term munchkin now, and I didn't realize it until I think it was one of John Peterson's recent books, The Elusive Shift, I think it was. He says the term actually came from these younger players that were coming in, and that was thanks to the various basics. So that's the first fundamental thing. The second thing is, for whatever reason, the design team at TSR, they didn't really like the basic D&D game. It was created by some of their best designers, Tom Moldvay, David Zeb Cook, and Frank Mincer, in the various editions. Holmes, of course, was out of house when he did the original. But people didn't really want to work on it. They felt like AD&D was the prestigious one. And what that meant is that basic D&D ended up having this really free hand to do things. And it was, to me at least, a much more innovative system as a result. I talked about how Frank Minster's, you suddenly got this warfare and, this holding of domains. And that was in OD&D. He was just expanding what was in the original, but he really expanded it. He made it into, full systems, whereas in OD&D, they were, just barely asides that I suspect not many people used. Where, if you were playing companion level D&D, you were playing it with domains. You were ruling your own area of land, your own kingdom, county, whatever, which is unlike anything else. And so the innovation that came out of it is just extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, I felt though, and I don't know if this is true across all of them because I don't have my capacity for knowing about the later basic stuff is much lower. We didn't play through it. But paging through the Immortal series adventures, like the Immortal Storm, and it's got this wild cover with heroes in loincloths walking through lava. And then I look through the adventure and it's like you end up in Chicago. I'm like, wait a minute. This is there were all these amazing rules and somehow that's the adventure. And was that how did that end up happening? This sort of mismatch maybe between the discipline of the actual core sets and then.
Well, a few different things. First of all, there were increasing discrepancies between covers and products at the time. And increasingly, it was because they had the covers before the products. And I don't know that happened with the Immortal Storm, but it seems likely. I do record a number of cases in the later years, 80s, late 80s, where someone was handed a cover and said, and a title, usually a cover and a title, and said, okay, here's the title, here's the cover we have painted for it, please go write this adventure. As opposed to the converse. And in this case, I would expect maybe, I think the Immortal Storm was by Frank Mincer. Was that the first one? And if so, then he probably just had the ability to say, I don't care what the cover is, I'm going to design the adventure that I want. The Immortal set was a very, very weird set of rules that is often said that no one except Frank Mincer really understood what it was. It has all of this weird philosophy / cosmology about multiple dimensions and multiple planes and outer planes that aren't the great wheel ones that we know, but, just are all of these random things. And I believe, if I recall correctly, that it's not even technically Chicago that you're in, but it's an outer plane that reflects what our world looks like or something like that. And so it was actually within the cosmology that he laid out. But any other D&D set would have laid it out as what they called at the time an alternate prime material plane. Um, I mean, Gary Gygax famously had 5 different Earths that he laid out with different levels of technology, which I think I mentioned in the World of Greyhawk history, maybe. And so, his Chicago definitely would have been, one of these alternate planes, an alternate Earth, because of course Greyhawk was Earth too, Oith. But for Frank Mitzer, it was an outer plane, and that fit with his cosmology. It's just not the one we're used to from D&D.
I love it. And the idea of this sort of disconnect between management structures, authors, how they might go off and create a product, and then everybody finds out what it is. I mean, to me, in your preview, when you talk about Palace of the Silver Princess, that's kind of the most notorious example of that. And could you share some of those details for folks who haven't heard about it?
Yeah, Palace of the Silver Princess is the famously destroyed D&D product, B3. It exists in 2 different editions. One has an orange cover, one has a green cover. They have the same picture by Errol Otis, I believe, on both of them. And it did not have quite the same disconnect as you might expect. The problem there was that the person doing the original adventure was kind of a disciple of Gary Gygax, and everyone was told you cannot mess with her content. And so she produced content. The editorial team really didn't go over it very much. And that may have been some of the problem. We have 40 years later all kinds of different stories of what happened. Um, there's the fact that the content was kind of a throwback and that it was do it yourself. The rooms in the adventure were not filled in. The DM was expected to fill them in themselves from random charts, which is how things were done in the original basic adventure in Search of Adventure. But it was not how they were doing things, from the Keep on the Borderlands onward. There also were maybe BDSM overtones or undertones, or something in it, which made management very uncomfortable when they saw them. The author said, I don't know anything about BDSM, but she was a big fan of the Gore novels. So the book also had a lot of artwork by Errol Otis, who, of course, is a magnificent artist, but kind of tending toward the alternative underground area, which is a lot of what made him so magnificent and why I love the stuff he's doing even today. And maybe some of it was provocative, maybe some of it was making fun of management. We're not really sure. But what we do know is that the book got through without much oversight from design, that it was fully printed, that it was given out to people at TSR. I believe that it went into some minor amount of distribution. It didn't, from what I understand, some places got it, but it wasn't, fully out there. And then it landed on probably one of the Bloom's desks. Again, the stories vary. And they went crazy. And they went through TSR, grabbing all the copies they could get. Well, all of the designers and everyone else who had gotten copies did everything that they could to hide it. That they pulled it back out of distribution, however far it had gotten. And then they sent all of the copies to a landfill with one of the staffers specifically going out there to watch the books go all the way into the landfill to make sure that nothing escaped on the way. And copies have survived. I suspect it's not even the rarest D&D product. I don't know how many. I think it probably goes for at least $1,000 now. I haven't looked at the prices now, but somewhere in that range, because it is a rarity. And a new edition was done. I think Tom Moldvay took the original content, and it's not like the original hardly at all. There's a little bit of shared content between them. And it even has some of the artwork that, may have been awkward in it, but that's the one that has the seal of approval. But it's definitely a great story that shows the disconnect between management and design. And I mean, the disconnect between Gary and design for that matter. And also that shows, I think, how young, amateurish, immature TSR still was at the time, because I mean, that would just be unthinkable for most modern publishers to get something printed that was so fundamentally flawed in the views of management.
Right. Right. And had gone through without review. Amazing. Any other product histories that jump out at you as being interesting that you want to share?
Well, basic D&D is just such an interesting line because of its innovation. I think the other ones that are really interesting, and I'm kind of repeating a theme here, are the Blackmoor ones that they came out kind of just as Bruce Hurd was taking over. Frank Mincer was the one who, was the lead of it in the BCMI era, and then he went off to Gary Gygax's new company, and Bruce Hurd, as the acquisitions editor, kind of de facto takes over basic D&D because, as I said, the TSR staff doesn't really want to work on it. And the first thing that he's handed and told, "You're doing this," is Blackmoor, which is great because we got Blackmoor in, one of the earliest versions ever. And two of the adventures particularly stand out to me, and they're Temple of the Frog, which was DA2, and the City of the Gods, which are DA3. And they stand out just because they're both such legendary adventures. And they both show this weird science fantasy, science fiction connection to Blackmoor, which Dave Arneson said really wasn't that common, but it happened to occur in these two adventures that they chose to publish. And the thing that I love the most about him is that this connection came because of another game they were playing, Stellar 7, I think it was called. It was the game that became Star Empires when it was published by TSR. And this was a more, strategic science fiction game. And in their particular game of it that they were playing, which led to its publication, Blackmoor was one of the planets in this science fiction universe. And so eventually, at various times, like a certain human empire, dropped people on the planet, and some other empire did too. And these stories became incorporated into Blackmoor as Stephen Rockamore was asked to, hey, make a villain. And he made someone called Stephen the Rock, which came from one of these crashed ships, and went and got all of these cultists together to form this Temple of the Frog. And the City of the Gods, as I understand it, is probably further from the original. It's described now as being that ship that crash landed that brought Stephen there in the TSRs, and that's probably not how it happened in the original campaign. But it's just fascinating again that these adventures, which go back to these prehistory and show these legends. But the other ones that I talk about, even if the history behind them isn't quite as interesting, are the Gazetteers, starting with the Grand Duchy of Karamikos by Aaron Alston. And these were where Bruce Hurd really, started to get to do his own stuff rather than just what he was handed from, previous deals. And he said, hey, what if we start detailing this world that, is somewhat described in some of our other products, but hasn't ever been detailed. And we have each of these supplements be about one country. And this was actually, 4-6 months before the Forgotten Realms started doing the same thing. So this was, really the inciting incident of what if we had geographical splat books. And there also where a lot of the innovation came in that they had new classes, they had skills regularly appearing, which weren't regularly appearing in D&D at the time, and particularly not basic D&D. And so Bruce Hurd coming in and creating these things, even though, like I said, the history behind it isn't that amazing, it's still a remarkable historical milestone for, what came afterward.
Wow. Amazing.
I could sit here all day and hear these stories because it's just so fascinating to me. But we don't want to take up every single moment of your day, Shannon. So I will say again that Designers and Dragons Origins is available on BackerKit right now as a 4-book slipcase, a PDF, print on demand, or an EPUB. And so you can go to designersanddragons.com. There's a link in our show notes for that. So anything else that you want to share? Where can people follow your work? Anything that you want to tease? Now's the time to do that.
So we do have audiobooks too. Evil Hat's actually putting them out in a whole bunch of different formats, and those are being done by Colby Elliott, who also did the audiobooks for the originals. So we are thrilled to have him working on that. Designersanddragons.com, which you mentioned, is the prime site for where I put out new blog posts and other information. And I also post a decent amount on Blue Sky nowadays, and I try and make sure interviews and stuff get mentioned there too. I am continuing to work on new projects. This is the first 4 books of Designers and Dragons Origins, but I finished drafting those in 2023, finished editing them in 2024. Obviously, it's 2025 now. I've gotten the first book of AD&D second edition histories done, and I am hoping to get the second one done before the end of the year, but I still got a bit to do for it. I mentioned very briefly earlier a third edition of Designers and Dragons, the original company histories, and that's going to be my next big project. But in the meantime, I've written about 300,000 words, more than that, 350,000 words of new histories, which I call the lost histories. And I think we're going to offer those kind of casually to people who have read the original books, maybe sometime next year, before we start pushing it all together to update them into that third edition. So lots more coming. The next thing people will see will be the lost histories, and that will primarily be for people who have already read the originals and aren't necessarily looking for a third edition. They just want a couple more books to fill out their current set.
Amazing. Well, I can't wait for all of that.
Yeah.
Thank you for working on this, Shannon. Thank you for coming on our show. Thanks for the approach you take to these books. They are a joy, and you make our hobby better for it. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And I will somewhat selfishly say that I work on these primarily because they're a joy to me too. So I enjoy doing them. I enjoy finding the histories, the stories, and I enjoy sharing them.
Awesome.
And we will enjoy reading them.
Thanks again, Shannon. Take care.
And there you have it. What a great interview. I could have literally sat here all day and just listened to Shannon talk about all of these adventures.
Yeah. If I ever were on a Lost Island kind of thing and I needed to survive, I would love to have these tomes with me. And I think that I probably, if I got too hungry, I could eat them and survive from them because they fuel me so.
They are so delicious. And also delicious are our listeners. You are all wonderful out there. We appreciate you so much. You feed
tasty.
our souls. And some of you back us, you back us via our Patreon, which is at patreon.com/masteringdnd. And we so appreciate that too. We have Master of Dungeon supporters. We have Master of Realm supporters who get a shout out in our show notes. And we have Masters of the Multiverse, and they know what's coming right now. Agile Monk of Fantasy Companion Workshops, Keith Ammon of The Monsters Know What They're Doing, Lou Anders of Lazy Wolf Studios, Craig Bailey, Rudy Chainsaw Basso, Dave Bastiensen, Derek, the Bearded GM, Steve Bissonette, Merrick Blackman, Boss John, Calvin Bridges of Alos, Robo Ballin, Kevin Criswell, Dead Inertia DM, Evil John, Evan at Nimbleco, Will Doyle, Andy Edmonds at nerdronomicon.com, James Fisher, Vidulclis G, Scott Fitzgerald Gray at Insane Angel Studios, Ben Heisler and Paige Lightman, Sean Hurst, Hyperlexic, the Jaunty Mantis TTRPG podcast, Mark and Mary's Gaming Compound, The Mighty Jared, JR of the Twilight Perspective, JT Evans, Brian King, Jim Klingler, Gal Curamindy, Chad Lench, Paul Mata, the Mathemagician, Jaron from Mathis Arcanum, Eric Mengi, Anna B. Meyer of Fantasy Cartography, Trey McLemore, John Mickey, Sean Malley, Falcon Neal, Tom Nelson of the Deck of Player Safety, DT Norris of DT and Dragons, Phil Wirt from the Philadelphia Area Gaming Expo, Philip and Lindsay, Frog Prince at Tentacle Squelching Wetly, Post Fiction RPG Audio, Ricardo, who might adventure, Robert Pasley, Vladimir Prunner from Croatia, Ozymandias Rex, Runner Rick, Chance Russo at Drago Russo, Andy Shockney, Krishna Simosa, Tim Smith, Spark from Dunor Games, Jeff Stevens at jeffstevensgames.com, Josh and Lee Wanika of the Tabletop Journeys podcast, Talos the Stormlord, Jeremy Talaman from the D&D and TV podcast, Tres, Ryan Truk, Joe Tyler, Marcelo de Velasquez, the Valiant DM, James Walton, Graham Ward, Jason Ward from Accidental Cyclops Games, Javier Waziak, Waterford Wizard, Chris Webster, Zach Types, and Walt Winfrey. Thank you so much for your support. If you can't support us via our Patreon, it would be wonderful if you could go to wherever you listen to this show, or whether you're watching it on YouTube, and give us a rating. Give us some comments, give us a follow, give us a subscribe, give us a thumbs, give us a stars, give us what you can. Teos, what you been up to?
Well, the biggest thing I've been doing, and why you haven't seen anything like immediately on my blog or anything this week, is because I've been working with all of the awesome designers that are going to be on Drawsteel's Crack the Sun. And that project is just really getting into gear. Super exciting for me. Awesome to see the fine minds that are sharpening their pencils for this.
Mm-hmm. You can follow Teos at alphastream.org as well. Check out his stuff there. You can find me on all the socials at Sean Merwin. You can follow the podcast at Mastering D&D. Find us on Blue Sky. Join our community on Patreon. You can go to the YouTube channel. You can do all the things. Well, Teos, we've made people smarter with our news. We've become smarter by listening to Shannon Klein. So what are we going to do? Shannon Appelcline.
Smarter we are.
We've become so much smarter. Words hard.
Oh, man.
What are we going to do now? We're going to go drink.